welcome to another broadcast of Majoring in the Majors with Pastor S.J. Munson on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are available in podcast form. Find them at artistfirst.com. Your host is the author of two books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, the Hijacking of American Christianity. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Pastor S.J. Munson.
Hi, this is Pastor S.J. Munson, and welcome to Majoring in the Majors. Issues of economic inequality in the United States have been receiving increasing attention in the news, along with our current national debates on issues of race and systemic racism. To talk about these issues, we have with us this evening a special guest, Mr. Dedrick Asante-Muhammed of the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. Mr. Asante-Muhammed joined the coalition in January of 2019 as the Chief of Race, Wealth, and Community, and he currently serves as the Chief of Membership, Policy, and Equity. Mr. Asante-Muhammed, thank you so much for making the time to be with us this evening.
No, thanks for having me.
Before we get into our main topic, would you mind just filling us in, talking about the work of the coalition, what sort of things that they do, what communities they serve, and so forth?
Sure. So National Community Reinvestment Coalition, NCRC, started around 1991, and its focus was to be advocate for the Community Reinvestment Act, an important piece of legislation that was part of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, one of the last major civil rights legislations of the 60s. And the Community Reinvestment Act is focused on making sure that financial institutions like banks are investing in low to moderate income communities and communities of color in particular. And that is what NCRC is focused on, and we work with local organizations. We have about over 500 membership organizations across the country that do various work around fair housing, fair lending, and CRA. Great.
Thank you for that. Now, according to a Federal Reserve report from September of last year, that's 2020, and I'm quoting, long-standing and substantial wealth disparities between families in different racial and ethnic groups were little changed since the last survey in 2016. The typical white family now has 8 times the wealth of the typical black family and 5 times the wealth of the typical Hispanic family. I might also add black homeownership has risen only slightly since the 1970s, since the Fair Housing Act, only about, according to latest figures that I saw, about 0.5 percentage point. This wealth divide obviously is no accident. It certainly didn't happen overnight. Can you talk about some of the history and the policies that have got us here?
Yeah, I always like to say when I'm doing presentations that the foundation of racial inequality is racial economic inequality, and the foundation of racial economic inequality is the racial wealth divide. I think this term, racial wealth divide or racial wealth gap, is one that's only become kind of in popular parlance over the last maybe 5-8 years. But, I would argue, it's at the foundation of this country, right? It was, the mass enslavement of African people, which is actually taking people and creating them, turning them into private wealth for individuals to then create greater wealth using their labor, and then similarly, taking the land of America from indigenous peoples. All of, this country was founded on concentration of wealth along racial lines at the expense of some for others. And I think now we are dealing, we're looking at the contemporary realities of that, where you still see this massive racial wealth inequality between blacks and whites, or Native Americans and whites, and you still see a strong racial wealth inequality with Latinos and whites.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm assuming the recent pandemic we've been experiencing has also impacted this disparity, probably not in a good way. Could you mention that?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a lot of concern about COVID, because usually during economic recessions that you see those who are most vulnerable are the ones who suffer the most during these types of recessions. And I was concerned that during the COVID crisis, the COVID recession, that this would greatly strengthen racial wealth inequality. And I think we're too close in it to see what, we're not even clear if the COVID recession is over. Clearly, some of the COVID stimulus money is starting to come to an end. And by September, a lot of the benefits that the government had put forward to help people, and I think actually fairly successfully, the massive, kind of record-breaking trillions of dollars into making sure that as many parts of the country locked down, that people didn't get into abject poverty, people didn't get into being kicked out of their homes if they rented or if they were missing mortgage payments. I think all of that has actually been fairly effective, and even low and moderate income people have been able to maintain, for more or less, their lifestyles, their situations. I think just the challenging point, the challenging part is if you were financially vulnerable before the COVID crisis and you managed to maintain your financial vulnerability, that's still not a great space to be in. So, I'm not clear, and I don't think anyone's really clear on what are the long-term impacts of COVID and racial economic inequality. But I think, what we can point to is that there was consistent and long-term racial economic inequality pre-COVID, and we definitely don't think it's helped to bridge that inequality for the future.
Right. When you have a community that's already vulnerable, they're going to be that much more vulnerable in times of hardship. Now, during a ceremony last month, June of 2021, marking the anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre, President Biden described some initiatives which are designed to address issues of racial discrimination, specifically in housing, as well as loans for small businesses owned by people of color. Can you talk about those initiatives, what's been proposed, and how have they been received by the various segments of the Black community? Is it a start? Is it even a good start?
Yeah, I think it was important that President Biden did attend the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of what they call the race massacre in Tulsa, or the destruction of Black Wall Street, all referring to the same incident. And it was, I think important that he had mentioned that he was going to take action to address the racial wealth divide. My general critique is that I don't think what he has put forward is enough to substantively address the racial wealth divide, even in the immediate future. I think it was some positive reforms put forward to try to ensure that some of the government procurement that is aimed at small businesses and aimed at minority businesses substantially increase. And I do think that's a positive thing, and we'll have to look at the implementation to make sure that this increase in procurement dollars do go to small businesses and minority businesses in particular, particularly African American, Native American, Latino. So I think that's positive, but I don't think that even that substantive increase is enough to bridge this racial wealth inequality, where I believe the newest numbers are white Americans around $190,000 median wealth, and for Black Americans around, I believe, like $23,000, right? And we have about this $167,000 disparity in wealth. And again, this is so important because we think, I put forward that wealth is what is used by people to help them through crises, but also to take advantage of opportunity. And it really provides a better picture of your economic capacity than even income. And so this wealth inequality, is massive. And you mentioned before home ownership, Black home ownership is around 43%, white home ownership is around 73%. There hasn't been much bridging of that in the last 40 years or more, 40, 60 years. I've heard some people argue So, I think it's going to require a much more comprehensive approach to it. But it is positive that President Biden recognized that that history is still with us today and requires contemporary action.
Okay, so you see it as a positive step that he's beginning to address it, but it seems inadequate at this point to in comparison to the problem that's facing us. Dorothy Brown, who's a law professor at Emory University, published a book just this past spring, I think it was in March, came out, in which she documents how the federal tax code, which, by all intents and purposes should be colorblind, actually specifically targets black communities. Her book is called The Whiteness of Wealth. I don't know if you've gotten a chance to look at it or are familiar with it, but if you know anything about the tax code, that's something that really surprised me. I had no idea as a white person that tax codes were specifically targeting black communities. Can you address that?
Yeah, I probably can't address it that well in that I haven't read her book. I have seen some of the press, some articles written about the book. Maybe I've even heard an interview. My work around taxes has been more so focused around the regressive nature of taxes. So not 100% race specific in any way, but the idea that the wealthy for the last, again, since 1980 per se, there has been an ongoing pressure to cut taxes for the wealthy. And you could argue going back to Kennedy. I mean, John Kennedy was the one who really helped cut, a tax rate that was almost 80, 90%. It was the highest tax rate in the 60s or 50s. And then under Reagan, we saw a serious focus on cutting tax for the wealthy, and with that, less dollars for investment into what had made America a strong middle class economy. And this has a racial outcome in that blacks and Latinos are disproportionately lower in middle incomes, and you're having tax policy that helps the wealthiest 1% or 0.1% that is disenfranchising blacks and Latinos at high levels. So one other thing I'll just point out is people often will say there's not enough, okay, fine, there is this wealth divide, but the government doesn't have the funds necessary to really invest in bridging this inequality. But always like to highlight that as part of the tax code we have this investment in wealth and asset development. And we, in our tax code, there's about, I think last I saw, $750 billion a year that is used to help strengthen wealth. The challenge is most of that, hundreds of billions of dollars, go to the already wealthy and disproportionately build wealth amongst the wealthy, which then can increase wealth inequality as a whole, and in particular, racial wealth inequality.
Right. I mean, I guess if we're going to just speak bluntly, the problem is that white wealth is and has always been built on the backs of the black communities of color. How do we begin as a nation, given that it's in the foundation of our culture and our governance, how do we begin to dismantle that? And I'll add that as a pastor, as a white pastor, I know how difficult it can be to talk to people about, money, trying to loosen their grip on their purse strings. How do we begin to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm thinking about two different directions. I mean, one, people have been talking about, the country's has gone through a racial reckoning, and, in the aftermath of George Floyd and this second wave of Black Lives Matters protest. But, I think, a reckoning has really occur when there is push for a radical change in the way our economy works, because I think without that, we're not going to, address, this racial inequality. I don't think it's actually super challenging to turn this around. I just think we haven't had the will. Like, again, we have in our history created a middle class economy. You know, America hasn't always had a strong middle class. It was really 30s, 40s, into the 50s with a strong economy and strong government investment, subsidies to home ownership, subsidies to higher education, subsidies to affordable housing, and road construction. All of these things that created American middle class. That was a white American middle class, because during this time period there was still outright segregation, between blacks and whites in particular. What we have, we've turned away from that type of progressive investment in the mass of America. And I think, in order to have a strong middle class economy for the 21st century, we're going to have to reinvest, and that reinvestment, it will have to disproportionately be amongst communities of color, where you're seeing the greatest growth in population. And thus far, the country has not been willing to, take those actions. And, again, I think one reason it's important to look at racial economic inequality is it helps more clearly understand where the country is going. And it's clear that looking at the last 40 years, the country is not going in a place where we're bridging racial inequality, but where we are maintaining it, in some ways expanding it. So we really will have to make some serious shifts in policy that I think are doable. But again, the country hasn't shown the will to do that type of policy shift.
Mm-hmm. I've in preparation for this interview, I've listened to some of the interviews you've done elsewhere on C-SPAN and so forth, and I have to commend you for your self-control in response to some of the questions that you receive. Particularly, the reason I'm bringing that up is that I think, a big problem in talking to other white people is these myths that we believe about our country, that we believe this myth that this is a land of opportunity for everyone, and if you work hard, you can make it, and therefore, by extension, if you're not making it, there's something wrong with you. There's laziness or something like that. But of course, that is a myth that this country works for everybody, and it doesn't. It's a myth that helps to protect us as white people from the truth that of the injustices that we are part of a system of injustice. How do you begin to attack that, the mindset and the mentality among the white community toward these issues of injustice, economic injustice specifically?
Yeah, and I wouldn't say it's just limited to the white community. I mean, I think, many blacks, Latinos, Native Americans, you have this propaganda that, you come to America and then you will have you will have great success along with your hard work, and the rewards will automatically come back in proportion of how much energy and time you spend into working hard. And so, and I think that, goes through most communities. I think this is the positive aspect of people understanding that there is a racial wealth divide, and hearing more about these issues of systemic inequality and how there was redlining that to this day still impacts communities and neighborhoods. And so starting to understand structurally how we've created racial inequality in this country. I think there's been a lot of public awareness of the concentration of wealth in general and how economies can shape that. And so just working hard isn't enough, And I think even the COVID crisis was important in that, there was a recognition that we really needed government investment into entrepreneurs, into individual households in order to get through this unprecedented time. So the idea that just the market would solve everything, I think, was not something that people believed when the whole country was facing crisis. And I think if we can now understand, as the COVID crisis isn't as severe as it was in the past, but there are still ongoing crises, deep economic vulnerabilities that people were living with before COVID and are going to be living with after, that still require the type of investment and intervention that COVID created or called for the entire country.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of that, the issue of student debt is one that is affecting communities, white, black, and so forth. Student debt is a huge issue economically, but I haven't seen any much discussion about how that affects communities of color specifically. I haven't seen the statistics on that. Is there a wide discrepancy in terms of the amount of student debt carried by communities of color?
Yeah, so and this is a fairly newer phenomenon, but we are seeing more and more that African American college students are having a slightly higher level of college debt than whites, though overall, right, the average student debt for blacks in general compared to whites in general, I don't believe is as high because, again, the whites are still more likely to attend college, and so to even get some of that debt and are more likely to go into master's programs, PhD programs, where very large levels of debt are accrued. So, again, when you compare black college students to white college students, yes, you will see because of the economic need, the lack of wealth, they require to use more lending in order to get into college. But it's also, I think only 14% of the country or 14% of households today are dealing with student debt. So it's still, not something that the majority of households are dealing with. So, it is, it's a huge issue for those who are dealing with it. And then it's obviously not as severe an issue for the households that, don't have student debt today.
Right. Now, many people are talking about this idea of a baby bond, and I think you've mentioned it too in some interviews. Can you talk about what that is and what does that propose?
Yeah, no, and I think, we're talking about different ways to address racial wealth inequality, and just to name again, to outright name that we have to increase, I believe, home ownership in order to, bridge this racial wealth inequality. Because, for most Americans, home ownership is the primary source of wealth. And, you definitely do much more economically better if you are paying off monthly a mortgage than if you are paying into rent where you get no equity. Now, obviously, not all Americans will ever be homeowners, but we definitely, again, 73% is a quite high percentage for whites. And we did a paper about what it would take to get to 60% black home ownership. So I just want to highlight, I think home ownership is an important space. And now, there's been these innovative ideas by people like Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton on baby bonds, which is a way to help create wealth and make sure that all Americans, as they go into adulthood, have some type of wealth, some type of nest egg. I've heard Jesse Jackson in the past talk much about how challenging it is to try to be in a capitalist economy with no capital. And so the idea is that every American would get, and there's different amounts of money, but say $1,000 when they're born into some type of investment fund that would then accrue over years till they're 18 or 21 or 25, depending on the particular program. And there might be some matching funds or additional funds put in, depending particularly on the socioeconomic status of that household. The idea that we want to invest more in households that are low wealth, low income, so that, again, all Americans at 21, 25 will have a nest egg. It could be anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000 that could be used to help pay off college debt, or go into graduate school, or go into some type of technical school, or buy a house or start a business. And, do think, we had some great social programs in the 60s that were really income supplements, try to help people as they go through bad times, but not get into issues of starvation and these type of issues. And I think now there's a recognition that we need some wealth building social programs that allow people to, create economic sustainability over the long term.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's talk about what people are calling a third Reconstruction. The first Reconstruction, of course, being civil rights legislation that was advanced right after the Civil War in 1865. The following 10 years, Second Reconstruction. I'm assuming people would call the Second Reconstruction the Civil Rights era of the 60s, early 70s. And so they're talking about a new era of Reconstruction, a third Reconstruction. How do you feel about that? And if you were, so let's say President Biden were to come to you today and say, Dedrick, I want you to design policies for a third Reconstruction, what would that look like? And feel free to dream and to think big.
Yeah.
Where would you start?
Well, first, I've heard particularly people like Dr. Reverend Barber, who I used to work with when I was at the NAACP, and he is now leading a group called the Poor People's Campaign. And he in particular talk about this third Reconstruction. I think I would frame it differently in that, the first Reconstruction was this idea that after the Civil War, there was going to be a Reconstruction, in particular of the South, that created a racially equitable economy and society. But what was really, and there was some, progress, important progress for maybe about 5-10 years, pretty much as long as federal troops lasted. As federal troops were gone, what was really reconstructed was a brutal white supremacy. And, I would argue, in the 60s with what is called the Second Reconstruction, that, we did tear down, official segregation, but we still managed to maintain a segregated economy that maintained a pretty strong segregation in American life. So, again, I think, racial inequality, white supremacy was reconstructed in the 60s, right? And so I guess, in today, I think this idea of third Reconstruction, it can be looked at as that, we did successful, equitable Reconstruction 2 times already. Now we're doing a third one. I think, honestly, we've seen white supremacy reconstructed 2 times. And the question is, are we going to manage to maintain that in the 21st century? So, maybe I'm arguing, I think I might frame it more that we're looking for the first true Reconstruction of the United States in the 21st century, away from concentrated wealth and power among white citizens. So, getting to the question of, if I had broad power and whatever I said, I didn't have to worry about one particular senator to get on my side, but I could just kind of lay out the policy and it would be implemented. I do think some basic things like creating some programs to try to ensure near universal full employment. There's been white unemployment right now, I think is around 4%. Black unemployment, from what I remember last month, was 9.1%. 9.1% is pretty close to, I think, the height of national unemployment during the Great Recession might have been 10%, and probably for whites was only 9%. So as the economy supposedly coming back from the COVID recession, African Americans are still at, seriously high levels of unemployment. And I think, this has been an ongoing issue. Generally, African Americans had twice the unemployment rate of whites. It's hard to build wealth when you have such high levels of unemployment and, fairly high levels of not even being in the workforce. So I think, there would be some government programs to ensure, hiring, even creating jobs as was done in the 30s and 40s to make the labor market tighter to allow there to be kind of a creation of a new, stronger middle class. I would also go into, I do think as well, some type of universal Medicare is very important. Medical expenses is one of the top reasons for going into bankruptcy. I think also having universal Medicare would allow those who want to be entrepreneurs to enter into this space without having to, be so concerned, well, where am I going to get my health insurance if I quit my job and go into, entrepreneurship and trying to, start a company. It would allow, I think, more people to do more self-employment, entrepreneurship, and even have more mobility from job to job because your job wouldn't be tied to your health care. And I think that's an important thing. I think we even saw that in our current, in our most recent crisis, that if you have a public health crisis and jobs start shutting down, you don't want your health care tied to that. One smaller kind of reform that did occur during the Great Recession is that self-employed people were allowed to apply for unemployment. And again, I think that should be maintained past. I think it runs out at the end of August. I think that should be ongoing. I think we do, the country talks a lot about entrepreneurship and wanting to support Americans, that it's good for the economy to have all these entrepreneurs out there. Well, allowing self-employed people to get unemployment when, businesses don't work out, or they go, businesses have ups and downs, and you shouldn't pull away a safety net just because someone tried to start a business for themselves. So I think, that's a small reform, but I think an important one. Home ownership. We have to increase Black home ownership. I've seen some interesting bills that look at recognizing discrimination that African Americans faced when there was kind of massive increase in home ownership. I think white home ownership was around 40% in the 1930s, something to that effect, and then by the 1960s was about 60%. And that happened a lot through GI Bill programs where people could get these military loans. But again, there was, outright discrimination against African Americans at that time. I've seen some proposals to provide military VA loans to African Americans who had descendants from that time period. I think having some type of first-time home ownership loan, 0% down payment or zero down payment, and a good 30-year sustainable mortgage, could be very helpful in increasing Black home ownership, in particular Latino home ownership. So I think that's an important piece. And then I think, again, innovative programs like baby bonds. And I do believe that there should be reparations. I mean, I think you can conceivably get to racial economic equity and bridge the racial wealth divide without reparations. But I think, in order for this country to be a just country, I do believe in morality and spirituality. And I think, just for those reasons, should come to terms with its past and provide reparations. And again, to me, the metric to see if reparations has been effective is if it's helped bridge this racial wealth inequality. So those are some policies: home ownership, employment, some type of innovative wealth building program like possibly baby bonds, healthcare, all these things together. I think really could break up the white supremacist economy that's been the basis of our country.
Right. Now, I'm glad you brought up the topic of reparations. I was going to ask you about that. Could you talk about that a little bit more? And specifically, when we're talking about reparations, what are we talking about? For the sake of, we have people that live in other countries and maybe don't really know when we say reparations what exactly we're talking about. But what are we talking about? And there's many different proposals, many different ideas, I know. But what are some of the better ideas that you've heard in terms of reparations?
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about what are we talking about when we say reparations. I think generally this conversation we seem to be talking about America coming to terms and apologizing and making amends for racial discrimination against African Americans, going back to slavery and coming up to present day, where we've had issues of after slavery, had issues of legal segregation and ghettoization, mass incarceration. So the idea is that the country is recognizing that this is wrong, apologizing for it, and then investing to bridge that socioeconomic inequality that came as a result of those things. And so many of the people that I work with that that do work around reparations look again that the measure of successful reparations is bridging the black-white socioeconomic inequality. Reparations could just be an apology or, museums or education. I think those things can be important and are important, but I don't think without bridging the socioeconomic disparities are we really getting to the point where we are repairing the damages done. And I think that's where the evidence of repair comes in.
Now, we've been talking about the level of government policy, but what about on the individual level? What do you think, and this may be a tough question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, what do you think the average white American could do to help affect change, to help create more of a culture of equality and of shared wealth? I'm going to give you an example. Talking to a few of my white friends over the past year, some of them have said, I have these government stimulus checks I haven't used. I don't really need them right now because I have a job and I know that other people don't, or else, I know that I do need it, but there are other people that need it more. I could invest that in a scholarship fund for communities of color and that sort of thing. How can we be part of the solution? Certainly, there are people that resist the idea that we have systemic racism, but there are people too that say, "Hey, I acknowledge this is a problem. I am part of the problem. I am part of the system. How can I be part of the solution?"
Yeah. No, I think important piece is to recognize that is something you want to do. That the economy is designed in such a way that you are going to have to get past what is easiest to do if you want to, invest in businesses of color, organizations of color, people of color, what have you, because it's just, if you just did the easiest shopping, off of Amazon or your closest store, you're not going to bump into minority businesses as a whole, particularly black businesses, as quickly and as readily. So I think, saying that, hey, it is important to support small businesses, it's important to support small black businesses. I'm going to take that extra step to do that. My charitable giving this year, I'm going to focus on organizations, nonprofits that are led by people of color, that maybe focus in on serving those communities. I think all of that can be important, as well as obviously a political action, because I think individual charity is positive and is good, but we're not going to get to the repair we need without government action. So I think
Right.
Also how you engage in the political process and make it known that you are standing for these things. And it doesn't mean that you're going to be able to change your congressperson's opinion right away, or your senator, but just making it clear where you stand on these political issues, and engaging civically for those things as well are important. But standing out there and letting people know that you take this seriously and make it part of your life, is important.
Right. Sustained political pressure is important. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I really will get to this idea. Yeah, the sustained part, because it's one thing, to go through a phase and be, John Brown for like a couple months or what have you, but we're not going to solve this in a couple months. And so how do you work in your vision of racial justice into an everyday life that can be sustained over years is essential.
Maybe another tough question. Are you hopeful for the future, for the near future, or are you more of a long-term hope person, or how do you stand on the issue of being hopeful for the future?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not hopeful that the numbers I look at don't show to me that we are on a path toward bridging racial inequality. Now, I think I am a hopeful person in that I believe that change can occur. And I don't know why I have some type of optimistic outlook that change will occur, but I don't like to, confuse people that I look at the data and the history, and I'm just hopeful based on the data and history. Things point to us continuing the deep racial inequality we've had in this country. I mean, obviously, I do think that personal prejudice has declined over the last 40, 50 years as a whole. There's more social interaction amongst different races. But again, you don't see much bridging in terms of income inequality between blacks and whites, and home ownership and wealth. And we seem to be on that path going forward. I think some things that do inspire some aspects of hope is that there is greater recognition that the American economy, period, needs to be restructured in a way that's not as regressive and that is investing much more heavily in lower income, middle income households and communities, and a greater understanding of how deep and broad racial wealth inequality is, though I think we still have a long ways to go until that's as widespread understood as it needs to be. Mm-hmm.
We had on the show, I think it was a year ago, last December, Dr. Joe Fegan, who you may know is a well-known scholar in racism, a career of maybe 60 years or more. And he's now in his 80s and looking back, and I had asked him this question as well, and he said, I'm really not that hopeful, at least for the near future. He said, I would really need, if I got, a bunch of white people in a small group, and worked with them for about 6 months, continually. He said, I think I could begin to reach them and to begin to overcome the mentalities, the brainwashing and so forth that we receive, in this country growing up as white. But he said, I'm really not that hopeful, and that was sad to hear that, but not surprising, Is there any other issue that you would like to bring up at this time? Anything else that we've not talked about that you would we're hoping that I would mention, or anything like that? We have a little time left.
Yeah. This is an area I focus in so much, but, I think oftentimes when people are talking about racial justice, they will, focus in on incarceration, police brutality, these types of issues, because that has been the issues that have been getting the most public attention over the last, let's say, 10 years, with kind of both phases of Black Lives Matter hashtag movement, bringing public light to these things. And I think, these are important issues. I've done some work around, incarcerated people, and used to work for Reverend Sharpton before there was Twitter, before there's hashtags. There were activists out there fighting against police brutality and was engaged in different campaigns around that. But I really do, when I'm talking about racial economic inequality and bridging the racial wealth divide, I do think these are the ways that will help address some of these issues, because I do think it is, those who get abused, those who are disproportionately put in prison are those who are most economically vulnerable. I think those issues are so deeply interrelated. And I think that actually until we get rid of the economic marginalization, we won't get to the point where we are cutting back on mass incarceration at the level that I think is necessary, or cutting back on the brutality that's almost required to maintain a social order where there are so many that are cast off from a viable economic opportunities and economic sustainability. So just wanted to have the opportunity to connect how these racial economic inequality issues connect to these police brutality, mass incarceration issues that have gotten a lot and important media coverage over the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm. My wife and I were talking about this issue of law enforcement. And of course, recently there's been a cry to defund the police and so forth. And she said, well, what do you think about that, defunding the police? And I'm thinking, well, you know what? I don't know that I would say the issue is defunding, but maybe we need to take a step back and rethink how we do law enforcement, rethink the purpose of law enforcement, and how we fund law enforcement. Is it achieving the goals that we want? And if we look back on the history of law enforcement, of course, the purpose of law enforcement originally was to protect white property and to keep slaves from uprising and so forth. Is that do we draw a straight line from that to today, and do we want to continue that kind of thing? Where do you stand on the issue of defunding and law enforcement reform and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think people who argue for defund the police, inherent in most of their argument that I hear is this idea that they want to defund what they think is an abusive system so that they can fund investments in greater socioeconomic stability, right? I think I generally try to phrase it more so that I do want to defund police brutality, and then how can we better fund public safety? How can we better fund economic viability? Because I think, I do think that we've created a very weird system where for, almost every issue, whether, you see someone having some type of bipolar episode outside, even there's a wild dog in the neighborhood or what have you, for some reason we have a system where you call an armed agent of the government to come intervene. And then we wonder why there's such brutalization instead of we should be able to call in different types of public safety, social safety, representatives or even officers to come in to help engage these different issues. And so I think that is essential. And I think there's a lot more that can be done with public safety that doesn't require someone with, some years of arms training, but maybe very little community engagement training or even training on how to connect people to job placement services or these types of things. So, I think the defund the police, I think there's a lot of interesting ideas behind that. But, I think many of the people that, the people that are dealing with police brutality the most oftentimes are also dealing with criminal violence the most as well. And so it's a weird situation where they are over-policed and under-policed at the same time, because the criminal violence to them is oftentimes much less likely to be addressed, even though they are suffering much more from outright police violence to, police harassment and, being searched as they come in and out of a building, or just having kind of negative experience with police interactions. That there's also a problem of lack of policing or public safety for those communities. So I think we need to figure out a way to engage that, and not, when we say defund the police, think we need less public safety. And I think those who are making that argument are saying they want more public safety. It can get lost in that translation of defund the police.
Well, Mr. Dedrick Asante-Muhammed of the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, thank you so much for being with us this evening and talk about these issues. A wonderful discussion, and thank you so much for making time for us.
Yeah, no, thank you for the opportunity and for the all the conversations you've been having on the show.
Well, thank you, and thanks to those of you who've been listening and tuning in. And this is Pastor S.J. Munson signing off.